This is a chapter from towards the end of the first half of the book that I adapted, made into a short story that's going to be published in the Writers Inc. book this summer. It's called Maggie and Bobby. They first appear in the book in this chapter. They become fairly important for the rest of the book. Maggie and Bobby. I met Maggie Toronto when she was at the Spiritualist Church, where we were learning how to communicate with the dead. She was a childhood friend of my brother's girlfriend. After the shine of talking to dead people had worn off with the rest, Maggie stayed and was at services and in class with me. She was really pretty, about 4 years older than I. She was 10 years younger than her husband Bobby. Bobby Toronto had earned a doctorate in literature, was in the throes of a collapse, furious at the academic world as his dissertation was rejected and he was denied his PhD. Bobby was hurt, angry, and reclusive at that point, but he was willing to go into a very long and well-thought-out assessment of the whole ordeal, a process in itself that reminded me of a guy sliding down a steep hill toward the edge of a cliff and trying desperately to stop his descent by lying flat and digging into loose rocks with his hands and feet. Sometimes Maggie would pick me up and we would ride together to class. She lived a couple of streets down from my apartment. We got to be fairly good friends, which I guess was expected as we were spending 2 or 3 nights a week at the same place and her friend and my brother were living together. Sometimes Bobby came to church, but he was not into it as Maggie, as he was older and more intellectual in thinking. Their age difference split the generational divide, with Maggie coming of age at the time of the hippies. Bobby would have entered young adulthood just before the Beatles hit it big. From what I saw, he allowed her things such as spiritualism, natural healing, and not eating meat as just a part of what you'd expect a young woman to be into at that age. Bobby was great like that, as he could see everyone as a person who had to be understood apart from others. Each person was not just allowed a position as a generic human being, but each person was approached openly, as if he or she deserved a similar period of evaluation before an opinion was formed. I was undecided then if he was outside of his own head, his own thoughts enough to allow this, and it was completely internal, or if his ability to comprehend was so expansive that he lived in a world that was larger than the 6 inches in front of the eyes that most people seemed to be able to work with in any manageable way. Bobby was from near Jack Kerouac's hometown in Massachusetts. He spoke with the pack-the-car accent, dropping his R's. I spent some time with the Torontos in their house where Bobby, who was not yet working, would fill his day up ruminating about the doctoral program. They could not talk about it in a casual and dismissive way, creating an edited version for me, an uneducated factory worker who was still not yet 20 years old, and who had not yet developed a very good understanding of life in general and literature in particular. I got the full-on approach and appreciated the insider's perspective, even if it might have been a broad shot that would have been fired even if I was not within range. He had a few readings at the church where very specific things were told him, but he could not rationalize away his lucky guesses. Gerald, I listened to Maggie about the spiritualist stuff and natural healing, and I think it makes sense. Okay, I can see how this could be. When I get sick, I tell you, I'm calling out to my good old dependable Catholic God. He'd say something like that and laugh and then go into a very detailed, well laid out explanation of why he thought such a thing. He once said to me, the Catholics will tell you, give them to us till they're 7 and we'll have them for life, and that's true. No amount of education, no logical dissection can shake it from you. It's as solid a thing as there can be in a person's head, a part of the very fabric of who you are. I've tried to use the common sense I have that would prove the impossibility of something like transubstantiation. He faked an "oh no, don't go there" frightened look, then laughed and said, "But God damn it, I'm pulled right back with a voice that tells me not to question it." He thought a bit and said, "Remarkable how implanted, how ingrained something can be in a young mind. No religion is independently provable in an absolute way, yet people believe them with complete conviction. They will kill over their beliefs, go to war over them, and die. Yes, it's a remarkable thing, that religion. There seems to be an innate need for religion, something in a person that compels them to find this thing that fits this space in them. What do you think, Gerald?" He'd make a statement like that and follow with a question to me. I'd answer, and he'd listen intently, never cutting me off or dismissing me part way through by diverting his gaze or fiddling with something. After I'd spoken, he had asked me more detailed questions about things I said and then consider that response in the same way. He'd always have a follow-up question or comment. Discussions with Bobby never ended. They just evolved. If it was days or weeks later when we met again, he'd pick up where we left off, recap the last part briefly, and in the same steady and focused way make the next point or ask the next logical question. He'd get into his thinking presentation, sort of of a trance in a way I had not experienced. All was clear and cluttered to him, as if all of his thoughts were laid out to fill a room, and he could walk among them, pick them up, explain them, and then set them back down. Literature is a very difficult area of study. I hear these kids complaining about how hard school is, and they're studying to be social workers. Social workers? That's basket weaving. Basket weaving, I tell you. Communications degree? What the hell is that? I tell you, it's arts and crafts. It's basket weaving. Maggie and Bobby's finances were not terribly stable. Maggie worked as a substitute teacher, which meant she'd only work when someone called in sick, and had no income over breaks and no benefits. They decided to move into Maggie's parents' home to save some money and figure out what to do for their next move. At that same time this was going on with them, I had been fired from my factory job during a strike and a riot. I was falsely charged with a felony and faced going to prison. I had no income, so I had to move back to my mom's house. We decided to help each other move on the same day. Neither of us had much in the way of furniture or possessions of any sort, so the moves would not take too long. We could do both households in a single day. The day of the move, Maggie was called to work, which meant Bobby and I would be on our own. This was fine with me, but it was difficult for Bobby, as he never had to figure out anything on his own, such as running the hand truck we needed. He spent years and years as an academic buried in the bowels of the university system, becoming such a part of that world that the other worlds really had disappeared, or at least gone to the margins. He needed to rent a hand truck so we could load up the washer and dryer and refrigerator. As Maggie was rushing out the door, she said, "The rental place is just north of campus, you know, next to the co-op." She looked at Bobby as he tried to register this and said, "Gerald knows where the place is. You go in there and tell him who you are. I have it reserved." She handed him some folded money. "Put this in your wallet. The cost is $8 and you have 10 here. If you forget any of this, Gerald can help you." I could see Bobby making mental notes, clicking off things as she said them, and training his eyes on the money when she talked about that, and looking out the window off in the distance as if trying to fix the rental place in his mind. She left for work, which was a short walk from their place, and Bobby and I got in their old faded red pickup truck and headed out. "Okay, Gerald," he said, as we got to the end of the street. "Which direction is it?" He had forgotten already, if he had bothered to retain it. I'm guessing not, as I was there and I knew where it was, so he hadn't tried. We parked out in front of the rental store, and Bobby prepped himself to go in, repeating what Maggie told him to say a few times. He walked into the building with a great sense of purpose. When he got to the counter, said in a forced, boisterous way, "Hello there, I'm here to pick up and he looked to me. I said, "A hand truck." "Yes, one of those, a hand truck." "You, Bob?" the guy said. Bobby affirmed that with a cheerful, "Yes, sir, I am." The guy said, "Your wife called it in." He got the truck and had Bobby sign a form and pay the fee. Bobby said to the man, well, sort of shouted it in an overtop way, "Thank you and have a wonderful day." We walked out and I lifted the hand truck into the bed of his pickup. "Well, how'd I do?" he asked me. "What?" I said. I didn't understand what he meant. "How'd I do with that fella in there? I don't want to come off as sounding too educated. You know, I want to be like one of the guys who might have a beer after work and watch football on the weekends." I laughed and told him he did fine and said, "I bet he would never have pegged you for more than a bachelor's degree in social work, or a basket weaver, either one." He was buoyed by this whole working class thing, hanging out with me, a factory worker, a union man fired and charged with a felony because of a riot during a strike. He was going to stay in character as much as he could that day and get a more complete experience. He began dropping the G's off his words and acting happy to lift heavy things. He was inventing a working class character in his head and having fun with it. As he was an academic, it required frequent questions to me about style and form, which prompted reevaluations of his persona as we filled the truck, drove to his in-laws' home, and unloaded it several times. Now this is the stuff. This is the stuff of Kerouac and that group. He knew I read Kerouac and was getting down to my level of understanding him more, even though they grew up in the same part of the country and his mother was French-Canadian, the same as Kerouac's family. He had not been too impressed with Kerouac, having once told me, "I heard of this great writer, this man with so much to say, and I read his book On the Road. Here was a man supposedly the prophet of his generation, speaking in such a tiny voice. You know, Gerald, maybe I need to reassess this whole Kerouac Beat Generation thing. Maybe if I saw it from his perspective as a working man. You think that's it, Gerald? You think there could be an understanding of literature that is class-derived, maybe class-determined?" I said, I guess so. It depends on how you define literature in class, I imagine. He considered that thought for a second, then set it aside, possibly to dismiss it later, or perhaps he had dismissed it then as the mutterings of an uneducated person. Bobby never had to figure out lunch since he had been married. He started getting hungry. I was used to not eating during a workday, so I wasn't feeling it the same as him. He brought it up a couple of times, so I figured I should do something about it. There were a couple of cucumbers on the counter. I said we could eat those. Would that be a good lunch? He asked. Well, it would be something to eat, I said. Okay, let's do it. He handed me one and took the other. Okay, now what do we do? I bit the stem end off of mine and spit it out in my hand and took a bite out of it. I'm going to eat it like this, I said. Bobby got a repurposed orange juice jar that had been filled with water out of the refrigerator. He offered me some, which I declined. He sat on the step of the stairway to the second floor and with great purpose and awareness ate his cucumber and drank directly from the container. So this is how it's done, a simple lunch of cucumbers and water. He was happy to be in character and experience real life outside of academia. What would you call a lunch like this, he asked me. Cucumbers and water, I said and shrugged. He laughed and repeated the phrase a few times as if imagining it in different scenarios in his mind. I don't know how much he really experienced working class life that day, but the two of us did share a pretty awful reality of having to move back home after a big collapse in our lives. My fall wasn't such a big deal compared to his, as I was a lot younger and had not done much yet. He was seeing 10 years or more of work disappearing, his academic life over. I had lost my job and was facing prison, so maybe the emotional impact was similar. I guess mine could have been worse, as his did not come with a high probability of being assaulted. He helped me carry my boxes and furniture up to the bedroom I would use at my mom's place. It had been painted black a few years before by my brother with the idea that a black light would make the walls seem to disappear and glow-in-the-dark posters would appear to float in space. It didn't work. The trim painted bright yellow to appear as a framework on infinity of empty black space just looked like yellow trim on 100-year-old beat-up woodwork. The house was cockeyed without a right angle in the place. It was offering a real lower working-class experience to Bobby, I was sure. We installed my old life in the tiny bedroom. When we moved the last thing into the room, Bobby saw me hit rock bottom, as I had seen him do earlier that same day. I gave Bobby explicit instructions on how to make it back home. I even drew him a map to get him the 15 or 16 miles back to his in-laws, his new home. I went over them as he sat in the truck, and then I said goodbye.